The woman Sheikh Hamdan called at midnight, and what she said midnight is the honest hour. That is the thing about late night calls that makes them different from every other kind of communication. The performance of the day is over. The managed version of yourself that gets presented to the world from morning to evening has finally been set down. The space between who you are required to be and who you actually are closes in the dark in a way that the daylight hours never quite allow. And Sheikh Hamdan, a man whose entire waking life is structured around the requirement to be something specific for the world, made a call at midnight. Not to his team, not to his staff, not to anyone whose connection to him was professional or political or defined by the role he occupies rather than the person he is underneath it. He called her. The one person in his life at that moment who received the real version of him without the performance attached. And what she said when she answered, and what was said between them in the minutes that followed, is the closest thing to the unmanaged truth of Sheikh Hamdan's inner life that this story has ever produced. The call did not happen in isolation. It was the product of a specific period in his life. One of the harder periods, which in his case is saying something, given that the general texture of his private life has rarely been uncomplicated. The arranged marriage had recently completed its unraveling. The public version of his life was in the process of being recomposed around the absence in a way that required the kind of sustained performance that takes everything a person has to maintain. He was in the middle of the specific exhaustion that follows the end of something that was never good, but still managed to cost more than expected when it finally came apart. And in the middle of that exhaustion, at an hour when the requirement to perform had temporarily suspended itself, he reached for his phone and called her. She was not expecting it. The hour made it unexpected, even though the fact of him calling was not entirely a surprise. They had spoken before. Their connection was real and had its own history that predated this particular call. But the midnight timing carried a quality that she recognized immediately when she saw his name on her screen. Not a casual call, not a call made from boredom or routine or the ordinary maintenance of a relationship that runs on a regular schedule. A call made from need, from the specific human need that arises in the late hours when everything that has been managed through the day can no longer be managed, and what a person requires is not a solution or a strategy, but simply the voice of someone who knows them well enough to not require an explanation. She answered. That single act, the answering of a call at midnight from a man whose life was as complicated and as managed and as difficult to be connected to as his, says something about what she understood herself to be in relation to him. She was not someone who answered because it was convenient or because the call fit into the official architecture of anything. She answered because when he called, she was the person who answered. That was the nature of what they had. Uncomplicated in that specific way. Whatever complications surrounded everything else about their connection, the answering itself was simple. He called. She picked up. And the midnight conversation began. What he said first was not something dramatic. That is always the surprising detail when people learn about these kinds of moments in the lives of figures who seem to exist at a remove from ordinary human experience. The first thing was quiet, a voice carrying the specific quality of tiredness that is not about sleep, but about the accumulated weight of a day and a life and a chapter that has been harder than the public version of any of it has ever been permitted to show. He said he was tired. Not the word tired specifically, perhaps, but the feeling of it. the wanting to stop performing, the needing to be somewhere, even if only in a voice on a phone in the dark, where the performance was not required. She said, I know. 2 words, but the 2 words that a person most needs to hear when they are in the place he was calling from. Not I understand, which can be offered by anyone who has heard a sufficient summary of the circumstances. I know. The specific knowing that comes from proximity to a person's actual life rather than to the official version of it. She knew because she had been close enough to the real version of him, the tired one, the private one, the one that midnight reveals rather than the one that noon requires to know without needing it explained. And in the knowing, in the simple direct acknowledgement that she already had the information he was trying to communicate, something in him released. The way things release when you stop carrying them alone. What followed was not a conversation about solutions. There were no solutions to be arrived at in that call. The circumstances that were producing his exhaustion were not going to be changed by anything said between two people on a phone at midnight. The arranged marriage was over in the way it was over. The chapter ahead of him was going to require what it was going to require, regardless of how either of them felt about it. The life he was returning to in the morning was the same life it had been when he made the call. None of that was going to change, and she understood that it was not going to change. And so she did not try to fix it or solve it or offer the kind of forward looking optimism that well meaning people offer when someone they care about is struggling. And optimism is the only tool they have available. She just stayed on the call, present, in the specific way that certain people know how to be present, without filling the silence unnecessarily, without performing concern in a way that would have made him feel that his honesty had produced a new kind of performance in response. She stayed on the line, and she was there, and that was what the call was for. Not the words, not the solutions, the presence, the simple, unglamorous, deeply human experience of not being alone in the dark when the dark is the kind that requires company. The call ended the way these calls always end, not with resolution, with the ordinary management of time. The hour making further conversation impractical, the morning already beginning to make its requirements felt even in the middle of the night, the performance of the next day already assembling itself on the edges of the present moment. He said what people say at the end of calls that mattered. She said what people say when they understand that what just happened was real and that the realness of it is going to have to be enough. And the call ended, and the midnight went back to being midnight. And Hamdan went back to being alone in the way that the Crown Prince of Dubai is always alone, even when the room is full of people who are paid to be there. But for the length of that call, he had not been alone. He had been somewhere real, with someone who answered at midnight and said, I know, and stayed on the line until the staying was enough. And in a life as managed and as performed and as carefully separated from its own private truth as his has always been, that midnight call and what she said was one of the most real things that has ever happened to him. Subscribe to this channel and hit the bell. Every week I bring you the real story of Sheikh Hamdan, the midnight calls, the voices that answered, and the truth that only surfaces when the performance of the day is finally, briefly over.